Right, thank you very much, Steve. There are a few things there which I thought we could actually build on in the discussion, but I think we'll stick with the process and we'll have another speaker and then we'll see if we can get the conversation moving. But our third speaker, we've already heard a little bit from here. It says here that Jerome Chapman is the Deputy Commissioner for the EGCC, but I happen to know that Nanette is on holiday, so that means he is actually the Acting Commissioner at the moment, so be very afraid. So maybe with a slightly different perspective coming from the consumer side. Jerome, please.
Thank you, John. Jerome Chapman, Deputy Commissioner of the Office of the Electricity and Gas Complaints Commissioner. Very grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak to you and address you about this topic and give you our insight and observations on our experience in dealing with consumer impacts. So just a little bit about the EGCC. Over the last 10 years, we've dealt with over 50,000 inquiries and complaints. So that's us dealing with impacts from the changes that you make in your companies. We've investigated over 2,000 complaints in the last 10 years, and those are in-depth investigations generally, and we call those deadlocked complaints, and we'll come back to those a little bit later. And finally, just of all the complaint issues that are registered at our office, 60 to 75% of those from year to year about billing or customer service. So that's what we've been talking about today. Any changes that you make to distribution pricing, and if those are passed through, those are going to impact billing, and the way that you manage those communications will impact your customer service. So I just want to give a brief story about some impact that the actions that companies take can impact on consumers. So we have Mr. Jones, who owns a farm. Mr. Jones' farm has been in the family for generations. The family has power poles and lines on their property which supply their neighbours. So decades ago, when the lines were installed, it was the neighbourly thing to do to give permission for those lines and poles to be installed on the property. Those poles have required replacement, and from Mr. Jones's perspective, the replacement has gone ahead without his notice. And between, myself and the audience here, we probably think that the impact on Mr. Jones is quite minor. But in Mr. Jones's eyes and the way that he uses his farm, he views the impact as something equivalent to this. So the pole might have moved a few metres, the pole might be slightly bigger, it might be concrete rather than hardwood, but from Mr. Jones's perspective, it's a massive impact. He doesn't like it. He feels he hasn't been consulted. I think most people would agree that the simple act of communicating with that particular affected consumer or landowner would go a long way to either mitigate or eliminate the impact on that particular consumer. So I just want to talk about 4 things in the 10 minutes that I have today, and I just want to give a couple more examples of impacts on consumers that we've observed, and that's not to point the finger at any companies, and the information that I'll display is available, publicly available information. It's in our annual reports and our 6 monthly statistics, so it won't be a surprise to many people in this room. I want to just talk briefly about resistance to change, and we've talked, I think most of the speakers today have talked about some element of change and whether people are willing to change or resistant to it. I just want to make some comments on communication and then just finish off with a few things that we all should, think about. So the 2 examples of consumer impacts that I want to talk about today is firstly a company, a distribution company who direct bills and has a demand-based pricing structure. The second is a retailer who a few years ago made changes to their billing system. And I just want to show you the impact that that's had on the work at our office. So this is just a graph of a graph showing the percentage of deadlocked complaints, or the complaints that we investigate, which is represented by the blue line. So what you can see is that's data for the last 4 years. So this particular company, from 2013 to this year, 2016, the proportion of deadlock complaints relative to other distributors in the industry has ranged between 35% and 26%. And the bottom line, which you probably can't really see there, is an orange line which represents the market share of that company. So this is a company, obviously, that has a lot of interaction with consumers, and that's a decision that they've made to front the communications with their customers about the way that they bill and basically to bill them directly. And this is an example of a retailer changing their billing system a couple of years ago. So you can see that after the billing system has changed, the blue line again has increased the proportion of complaints. So this company in 2015 had 22% market share, yet they represented 63% of all deadlock complaints that we investigated. So the point that I'm wanting to make is that the changes that you make, and these are changes that have been made individually by companies rather than by the industry as a whole. So potentially, if the whole industry is making changes, then you can expect that this will have an impact on consumers. So I just want to talk briefly about resistance to change, and I thought I'd use a Dilbert cartoon to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. And I understand that engineers and technical people relate quite well to Dilbert. So Dilbert's talking to his boss, and his boss says, "I'm getting reports that you're resistant to change." Dilbert says, "I only resist terrible ideas, but I can see how that would confuse you." So his boss says, "Whatever you're doing, cut it out." And Dilbert says, "Should I stop being rational in general or only in this one way?" And I think we're in this room, I think we've got engineers and economists and technical people who think that what we're doing or what we're about to do or what the EA is proposing is a good idea. And you can convince yourselves of that, but it's about convincing the people who are not in this room, consumers, that what you're doing is good for them. And I think that illustrates it quite well. So just another example, and I know Steve's talked about this just before me, but this is, I think, is also an example of consumers being resistant to change. So you have a pricing model which gives people or people volunteer to be engaged with responding to pricing signals. And I know that there's some constraints on availability of those pricing options, but still, this is a diagram showing the market share of retailers in New Zealand, and the big purple arrow is pointing to Flick, Energy and Electric Kiwi, which represent less than 1% of the market share at the moment. So that's not to take away from what the companies are doing, but in terms of consumers who have the opportunity to have cheaper pricing, because that's the incentive to move generally to those new retailers, consumers are still very reluctant to do so. So can resistance to change be overcome by standard communication? And we've talked about communication quite a lot today, I think. And just as an example, there's about 1.8 million ICPs, and that give or take. So for us, that means that the EGCC, our contact details are on every single invoice that goes out every month, which means, and that's been a requirement for retailers since April 2010. So that means there's been 77 months since April 2010 with bills with our details on it. That means that there's over 140 million pieces of correspondence that has gone out over the last 6.5 years with our contact details on it, our name on it, yet we only have 6% unprompted awareness of the EGCC. So in terms of a communication message, when you are thinking about making change, I mean, the way that you communicate change is going to be quite important. And it's not about communicating to everybody. I think you're better off directing your your communication to the people who will be directly affected by the changes you are making, and you can fully direct your efforts in communication to those people, because that's where it's going to matter. So just some things to consider. I think any change that you make will have an impact on consumers. And consumers basically want, and we've talked about this earlier, want reliable supply and at a reasonable cost. And I think Todd, mentioned earlier that consumers on average on a survey in America at a conference that he was at spend 8 minutes a year thinking about their electricity pricing, or electricity, I think, in general. So that's a big, barrier for the industry to overcome if you're wanting people to be more engaged with pricing and being able to respond to pricing signals. I think a lot of the discussion today is sort of revolved around who's going to explain pricing. So I think retailers are a little bit uneasy that if 29 different distribution companies decide to change their pricing over the next 5 years, that you're going to have someone in your call centre who understands 29 different pricing methodologies and are going to be able to explain the differences in their pricing to that particular consumer. So I haven't heard really anything from the floor today about how that's going to be addressed and whether or not that's something that ends up, or whether a solution to that is distributors taking their own calls and explaining directly to consumers, and whether that means direct billing. And also, given that companies are committed to making these changes, or some of these changes, do companies have adequate resources to deal with the impact that you're going to have on consumers? And that's a very real thing for consumers and the industry to think about. So, thank you, John. Well inside 10 minutes, I think.